The showroom gleamed under the bright overhead lights, the scent of polished leather and fresh car wax filling the air. It was a place where luxury met power, where the rich and influential walked in without hesitation, ready to spend millions on their dream cars. But today, among the well-dressed customers and confident salespeople, there stood a woman who seemed out of place. She was dressed simply. An old cotton dress, slightly wrinkled, with a worn-out purse slung over her shoulder. Her hair was neatly tied back, and her face carried the quiet grace of someone who had seen life's ups and downs. She wasn't flashy. She wasn't draped in designer clothes or expensive jewelry. But there was something about her, a quiet dignity and unshaken confidence, that should have made people look twice. Instead, they barely glanced at her. She stepped forward, her eyes scanning the luxurious vehicles lined up before her. Her fingers brushed lightly against the smooth surface of a sleek black sedan, admiring its beauty. But before she could take another step, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, ma'am," a salesman said, stepping in front of her. He was tall, well-groomed, and dressed in a sharp suit. His expression wasn't welcoming. It was filled with skepticism, almost annoyance. "Can I help you with something?" The woman offered a polite smile. "Yes, I'd like to inquire about this car. How much does it cost?" The salesman's lips twitched, barely hiding his smirk. He crossed his arms and tilted his head. "This one. It's quite expensive," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Are you sure this is what you're looking for?" She nodded. "Yes. Could you tell me about its features?" A snicker came from behind her. She turned slightly and saw another salesman whispering to a colleague. They weren't even trying to be discreet. She heard one of them mutter, "She looks like she can't even afford a taxi ride." Her fingers tightened around the strap of her purse, but she remained calm. "I'd just like to know the details," she repeated, meeting the salesman's eyes. He sighed, clearly uninterested. "Look, ma'am, these cars are meant for serious buyers. Maybe you'd like to check out something more affordable." His eyes flickered toward the entrance, as if hinting she should leave. A few customers nearby turned to look, their gazes a mixture of curiosity and amusement. The woman could feel their judgment, their disbelief that someone like her would even think of buying a luxury car. But she didn't argue. She didn't plead or try to prove herself. Instead, she gave a small nod and turned away. As she walked out of the dealership, the laughter and whispers trailed behind her. The door closed with a soft click, shutting her out of the world of the wealthy and the privileged. That night, the salesman shared the story with their colleagues over coffee, chuckling at the poor woman who had dared to step into their showroom. They didn't know who she was. They didn't care. To them, she was just another nobody who had no place in their elite world. But what they didn't realize was that their world was about to turn upside down. The next day, just as the dealership opened, a sight left everyone speechless. A gleaming Rolls-Royce Phantom, the pinnacle of luxury, rolled into the showroom's driveway. The valet scrambled to open the door, and as the driver stepped out in a crisp black uniform, the staff rushed forward, eager to greet whoever owned such a magnificent car. And then she stepped out. The same woman they had laughed at just the day before. But this time she wasn't alone. This time, the man beside her was someone they all recognized, someone whose mere presence commanded respect. And the moment they saw him, the color drained from their faces. The moment stretched long and heavy. The salesman who had mocked the woman just a day ago now stood frozen, their practiced smiles vanishing. The sight of the man beside her sent a wave of unease through the showroom. He was tall, dressed in a sharp, custom-tailored suit, exuding quiet authority. His watch alone was worth more than some of the cars on display. His presence was commanding, but it wasn't just his appearance that made their hearts race. It was who he was. One of the managers gulped, recognizing him immediately. He had seen this man's face in business magazines, heard his name in circles where only the powerful were mentioned. He wasn't just wealthy, he was a billionaire. A man whose influence could make or break companies with a single decision. And now, he stood beside the woman they had treated like a nobody. The billionaire gently placed a hand on the woman's back, guiding her forward with a quiet sort of protectiveness. She walked with the same grace as before, but this time no one dared to ignore her. The laughter from yesterday had been replaced with an unsettling silence. A nervous salesman stepped forward, the same one who had dismissed her before. His voice wavered slightly. "Welcome, sir. Welcome, ma'am. How can we assist you today?" The woman didn't respond immediately. She glanced around the showroom, her eyes lingering on the expensive cars she had admired the day before. The salesman fidgeted under her gaze. Did she remember how they had treated her? Did she recognize the way they had laughed behind her back? He tried to maintain his composure, but his hands trembled slightly. The billionaire finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "My wife was here yesterday." The words were simple, but they carried weight. The tension in the room thickened. The woman, his wife. The same woman they had judged so easily. The realization hit them hard, and their faces burned with embarrassment. The billionaire continued, his eyes locked onto the salesman. "She came here to inquire about a car, but she was disrespected. Is this how you treat your customers?" The salesman swallowed hard, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. He wanted to deny it, to make an excuse, but he knew it wouldn't help. The woman hadn't made a scene yesterday. She hadn't yelled or argued. But now, standing beside her husband, her silence was louder than any words could have been. The manager stepped in quickly, his voice overly polite. "Sir, I assure you there must have been some misunderstanding. We deeply value all our customers." The billionaire raised a hand, cutting him off. His eyes were cold, unreadable. "Misunderstanding?" He glanced at his wife. "Did you misunderstand something yesterday?" The woman met her husband's gaze and gave a small, knowing smile. "No," she said simply. "I was told I didn't belong here." Her words, though soft, hit like a hammer. The employees shifted uncomfortably, their faces pale. The billionaire let the silence stretch before speaking again. "That's unfortunate," he said, "because I had planned to buy several cars from this dealership. But I don't do business with people who judge others based on appearances." A visible ripple of panic ran through the staff. Losing a sale from an ordinary customer was one thing, but losing a billionaire's business, that was a disaster. The manager's forehead glistened with sweat. "Sir, please, let's not be hasty. We can make this right." The billionaire turned away as if he had already dismissed them from his mind. He looked at his wife instead. "Do you still want the car you liked?" She glanced at the sleek black sedan from yesterday. For a moment she seemed lost in thought. Then she shook her head. "No," she said softly. "I don't think I want anything from here." Her husband nodded. "Then we'll go elsewhere." The staff watched helplessly as he pulled out his phone and made a single call. They could only hear fragments of the conversation, but it was enough to send chills down their spines. Words like "new supplier" and "better dealership" reached their ears. They realized, too late, that this man wasn't just a customer. He was someone who could influence which businesses thrived and which ones failed. The woman and her husband turned to leave, but just as they reached the door, something unexpected happened. A young salesman, different from the others, rushed forward. He had been there yesterday too, but unlike his colleagues, he hadn't laughed. He had seen what happened but had been too afraid to speak up. Now he hesitated before them, his hands clenched at his sides. "Ma'am," he said, his voice uncertain but sincere. "I'm sorry. You didn't deserve that." The woman paused, looking at him with an unreadable expression. Then she smiled, a warm, genuine smile. "Thank you," she said. The billionaire gave the young man a single, approving nod before leading his wife outside. The Rolls-Royce was still waiting, shining under the sun like a silent symbol of the power they wielded. As they drove away, the woman turned to her husband. "You didn't have to do all that," she said, her voice amused but touched. He reached over and took her hand. "You're my wife," he said simply. "No one disrespects you." She squeezed his hand, her heart swelling with quiet gratitude. It wasn't about money or power or proving a point. It was about respect. And in that moment, she knew she had everything she would ever need. Back at the dealership, the employees stood in stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. Some felt ashamed. Others felt fearful of what was to come. And the young salesman, the only one who had apologized, stood with a thoughtful expression. He had learned something valuable that day, something more important than just selling cars. And he would never forget it. As the Rolls-Royce disappeared down the road, the dealership remained eerily silent. The employees exchanged uneasy glances, realizing they had made a mistake, one that could cost them more than just a single sale. The billionaire wasn't just any customer. He had influence, connections, and the power to change the reputation of their dealership with just a few words. The manager rubbed his forehead, his mind racing. "We need to fix this," he muttered under his breath. He turned to the young salesman who had apologized. "Ooh, what's her name? Do you know anything about her?" The young man hesitated. He had noticed her kind smile, the way she carried herself with quiet confidence, but he hadn't thought to ask for her name. I don't know," he admitted. The manager exhaled sharply, his frustration growing. "Great. So now we just wait and see if we lose business because of this." The other salesmen, the ones who had laughed at the woman, shifted uncomfortably. They hadn't thought twice before judging her, and now, the weight of their actions settled heavily on their shoulders. But the real consequences were only beginning. That evening, as the manager scrolled through his phone, a news article caught his eye. His breath hitched as he read the headline: "Billionaire refuses to buy from local dealership after wife faces discrimination." The article didn't name their business directly, but it didn't need to. People in the industry would connect the dots. Worse, the article was already gaining traction online. Comments flooded in, condemning the way the woman had been treated. Some people even claimed they would never buy from that dealership again. The manager's hands tightened around his phone. He had worked for years to build the dealership's reputation, and now, in just a day, everything was crumbling. He had to do something before it got worse. Meanwhile, across town, the woman sat in her home, sipping tea as she gazed out the window. The evening light cast a golden hue over the city, but her mind was elsewhere. She wasn't angry about what had happened. She had experienced judgment before, people assuming things about her just because she didn't flaunt wealth. But this time was different. This time her husband had witnessed it too. And she knew how he was. He didn't let things go easily. She turned to him, watching as he sat across from her, his expression unreadable. "You didn't have to do all that," she said softly. "I didn't mind." He looked up, meeting her gaze. "I did." His voice was firm, his eyes serious. "They looked at you like you were nothing. Like you didn't belong there." He shook his head. "I won't tolerate that." She sighed, setting her cup down. "What are you planning?" He leaned back, his fingers tapping against the table. "They need to understand that respect isn't about money or appearances." A small, knowing smile played at the corner of his lips. "And I think I know exactly how to teach them that lesson." The next morning, the dealership staff arrived to an unexpected sight. A row of expensive cars, Bentleys, Ferraris, and high-end SUVs, lined the parking lot. At first, they thought it was a special event, maybe a luxury showcase. But then they noticed the men in suits, speaking in hushed tones. And then the billionaire arrived. This time he wasn't alone. He had brought business associates, people who, just like him, had the power to shift markets, to decide where investments flowed. The moment he stepped inside, all eyes were on him. The manager rushed forward, forcing a smile. "Sir, welcome back. We're truly sorry about yesterday's misunderstanding. Please let us make things right." The billionaire's expression didn't change. He glanced around as if inspecting the place, then turned to his associates. "Gentlemen, this is the dealership I was telling you about," he said casually. "The one that decides a person's worth by their clothes." A murmur spread among the businessmen. Some of them exchanged amused glances, while others looked unimpressed. The manager's face paled. "Sir," the manager started again, his voice now pleading, "we assure you that was never our intention. If you give us another chance, we'd love to offer you." "I'm not here to buy," the billionaire interrupted, his tone final. "I'm here to observe." He gestured to his associates. "These men. They were considering making deals with your company. But now they have doubts." The weight of those words hit hard. The dealership wasn't just at risk of losing one wealthy customer. It was at risk of losing partnerships that could have sustained them for years. One of the billionaire's associates stepped forward, adjusting his cufflinks. "Respect in business is everything," he said simply. "If you can't treat a potential customer well, how can we trust you in a deal?" The silence that followed was deafening. And then, without another word, the group turned and left. The employees watched in stunned disbelief as the luxury cars pulled away, taking their future business with them. The manager stood frozen, his mind racing with the realization that one mistake, one moment of judgment, had cost them more than they ever could have imagined. Meanwhile, at home, the woman watched her husband with quiet amusement. "So that was your plan?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. He smirked. "A small lesson. They'll think twice before treating someone unfairly again." She shook her head, a soft chuckle escaping her lips. "You really don't let things go, do you?" He reached for her hand, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Not when it comes to you." And in that moment she realized something. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about power. It was about something far deeper, something rare. It was about being seen, being valued, being respected. And that, she knew, was worth more than anything money could buy. The atmosphere at the dealership had turned cold. The once lively showroom, filled with confident salespeople and eager customers, now felt heavy with unease. The fallout from the billionaire's visit was worse than they had feared. News had spread quickly. Calls from potential buyers were going unanswered, meetings with suppliers were suddenly postponed, and the usual flow of customers had slowed to a trickle. The manager sat in his office, staring blankly at his desk. His hands were clasped together, knuckles turning white. He had spent years building the dealership's reputation, securing deals, and ensuring high-profile clients walked through those doors. And now, because of one careless mistake, everything was falling apart. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. One of the senior salesmen stepped in, his face tense. "Sir, we just got a call from headquarters," he said cautiously. They're asking for an explanation. Apparently, a few investors are reconsidering their stake in our branch." The manager shut his eyes for a brief moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "This can't be happening," he muttered. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "We need to fix this. We need to get him back. I don't care how, just find a way." But deep down he knew it wouldn't be easy. The billionaire wasn't the kind of man who could be swayed with apologies and discounts. He had made his point clear. Across town, the billionaire was sitting in his private study, scrolling through messages on his phone. A few business acquaintances had reached out, amused by the dealership's desperation. Some had even called to say they had withdrawn their partnerships, wanting no association with a company that disrespected people based on appearances. His wife walked in, placing a cup of tea beside him. She sat across from him, studying his expression. "They're panicking, aren't they?" she asked, a knowing smile on her lips. He looked up, his gaze steady. "They are." She shook her head. "And what now? Are you going to let them struggle, or do you plan on giving them a way out?" He leaned back, his fingers tapping against the desk. "That depends." She tilted her head. "On what?" On whether they've actually learned anything, he said simply. The next morning, an unexpected visitor arrived at their home. The manager from the dealership stood outside the grand entrance, shifting nervously as he waited. He had barely slept, running through different ways to salvage the situation. Now, standing before the billionaire's towering estate, he felt smaller than ever. When the butler led him inside, he tried to steady his nerves. The house was nothing short of breathtaking. Expensive art adorned the walls, the furniture was elegant, and the sheer size of the place was overwhelming. He was escorted to the study, where the billionaire and his wife sat. They didn't look surprised to see him. If anything, they looked like they had been expecting this visit. The manager cleared his throat. "Sir, I want to sincerely apologize for what happened at the dealership," he started carefully. "It was unacceptable, and I take full responsibility." The billionaire remained silent, his expression unreadable. The manager felt his palms grow sweaty. "We value every customer," he continued, forcing a smile. "And we'd love the chance to prove that to you and your wife. If you'd be willing to give us another opportunity, we're prepared to offer you any car of your choice, completely complimentary." The woman raised an eyebrow, but her husband's face remained impassive. He let the words hang in the air before finally speaking. "So, your solution is to give us something for free?" The manager hesitated. "We just want to make things right," he said quickly. "We deeply regret how my employees treated your wife, and we—" The billionaire leaned forward slightly, cutting him off. "And what about the next customer who walks into your showroom?" he asked. "Someone who doesn't look wealthy. Someone who doesn't fit your idea of what a real buyer should look like. Will they be treated the same way she was?" The question left the manager speechless. He had come prepared with apologies, prepared with offers, but he hadn't come prepared for this. The woman finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. "You don't need to offer us a car," she said. "What you need to do is change the way you treat people." The words struck deeper than any financial loss ever could. The manager swallowed hard, realizing that they weren't asking for compensation. They were asking for something far more difficult: accountability. The tension in the room thickened. The manager knew that whatever happened next would determine the future of the dealership. And right now it was all hanging by a thread. The manager shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the weight of the billionaire's words pressing down on him. He had come expecting anger, perhaps even demands for compensation. But this was different. This was something he couldn't fix with discounts or empty apologies. He cleared his throat, trying to find the right words. "You're absolutely right," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "What happened shouldn't have happened. And I can't change the past, but I can make sure it never happens again." The billionaire studied him for a moment, as if measuring the sincerity in his words. His wife remained silent, her eyes steady. Then, just as the tension in the room reached its peak, the butler stepped in, a cautious look on his face. "Sir, there's someone at the door asking to speak with you," he said. The billionaire frowned. "Who?" "A woman," the butler said. "She wouldn't give her name. But she says it's important." The room fell into a brief silence. The manager glanced between the billionaire and his wife, unsure of what was happening. The billionaire gave a small nod. "Let her in." Moments later, the butler returned, leading in a woman who looked like she had walked straight out of a storm. Her clothes were wrinkled, her hair slightly disheveled, and there was a nervous energy about her. But her eyes carried something deeper. Urgency, fear, desperation. As soon as she stepped inside, she froze, her gaze locking onto the billionaire's wife. The color drained from her face. "It's you," she whispered. Confusion flickered across the wife's face. "I'm sorry. Do we know each other?" The woman hesitated, her fingers gripping the strap of her worn-out handbag. Then, taking a shaky breath, she stepped forward. "You don't remember me," she said almost to herself. "But I remember you." The billionaire leaned forward, his expression sharp. Who are you? The woman's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of a chair for support. I was there that day, she said. At the dealership. I saw everything. She swallowed hard. But that's not why I'm here. The room grew still. The billionaire's wife exchanged a glance with her husband, trying to make sense of what was happening. The manager sat stiffly, watching the scene unfold. The woman took a deep breath. I used to work there, she admitted. At the dealership. Her voice wavered slightly. Until they fired me. The billionaire's eyes narrowed. Why? The woman hesitated, looking down at the floor. Then slowly she lifted her gaze. Because I refused to treat people differently based on how they looked, she said. Because I spoke up when they asked me to ignore customers they thought wouldn't buy anything. She exhaled shakily. Because I defended people like you. The words hung heavy in the air. The manager stiffened. That's not. The woman shot him a sharp look. Don't lie, she snapped. You know exactly why they got rid of me. You saw it happen. The billionaire studied the manager, watching as guilt flickered across his face. The woman turned back to the billionaire's wife, her eyes now pleading. I didn't come here to ask for anything, she said. But when I saw what happened to you, I knew I had to warn you. The billionaire's wife frowned. Warn us about what? The woman clenched her fists, as if steadying herself. The dealership, she said. They're not just trying to fix their mistake. They're trying to cover it up. The manager stiffened. That's ridiculous. The woman ignored him, turning back to the billionaire. After what happened with you, they panicked, she continued. They've been scrambling, trying to do damage control. But instead of fixing the real problem, they're trying to bury it. They're destroying records, silencing employees who know too much, and, she swallowed hard, they're making sure people like me disappear. The billionaire's expression darkened. Disappear? The woman nodded. They threatened me, she admitted. Told me if I ever spoke about what I knew, I'd regret it. A heavy silence filled the room. The billionaire's wife leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. And why are you telling us this? The woman's eyes flickered with something raw. Because you're the only ones powerful enough to stop them. The words settled like a storm cloud over the room. The billionaire leaned back, his mind racing. His wife studied the woman carefully, understanding the risk she had taken just by coming here. The manager looked like he wanted to disappear. His face had turned pale, his confidence crumbling. For the first time, the billionaire's wife spoke with unmistakable determination. Then it's time we do something about it. And just like that, the conflict had escalated into something far bigger than anyone had anticipated. The room felt heavier than ever, the air thick with tension. The woman's words had shifted everything. What had started as a personal slight at a dealership had now turned into something far bigger, a deliberate, deep-rooted system of discrimination and cover-ups. The billionaire sat in silence, his fingers lightly tapping against the desk, his mind calculating the next move. His wife, on the other hand, had already made up her mind. She stood up, her voice steady. If they think they can silence people like you, they're wrong. The manager flinched slightly, realizing that any attempt to salvage the situation had now completely collapsed. He opened his mouth to speak, but the billionaire raised a hand, stopping him. I suggest you listen, the billionaire said, his voice calm but firm. Because this is no longer about saving your dealership. This is about what happens next. The woman who had come forward with the truth shifted uneasily. What can we do? She asked. They hold all the power. People are afraid of losing their jobs. They won't speak up. The billionaire met his wife's gaze. There was an unspoken understanding between them, one that had been built over years of facing the world together. He finally turned to the woman. Then we changed the game. That evening, a press conference was arranged. The billionaire wasn't just a powerful man. He was a man with connections, a man whose voice couldn't be ignored. When he spoke, people listened. And tonight they were going to hear everything. As the cameras flashed and reporters gathered, the billionaire's wife stepped forward. She wasn't just there as a silent figure by her husband's side. She had her own voice, her own story to tell. And she told it fearlessly. She recounted how she had been humiliated at the dealership, how she had been dismissed simply because she didn't look the part of a wealthy customer. Then she introduced the former employee, the woman who had risked everything to reveal the truth. The reporters listened in stunned silence as the woman explained the dealership's practices, the way they had been targeting and silencing employees who dared to treat customers with respect rather than judgment. The press conference made headlines instantly. Social media exploded with outrage, customers calling for boycotts, celebrities weighing in, even business analysts discussing how this could mark a turning point in corporate accountability. The dealership, once a prestigious name in the industry, was now under scrutiny like never before. The next morning, the consequences started unfolding rapidly. The dealership's headquarters released a public statement, claiming they had been unaware of the unethical practices at the branch. They announced an immediate internal investigation. Investors began pulling out. The manager, the man who had dismissed the billionaire's wife without a second thought, was removed from his position. But that wasn't the twist. The real twist came when the billionaire's wife, instead of walking away from the dealership's downfall, made a surprising move. She bought the dealership. With the power shift now in her hands, she took charge, ensuring that not only was the company's entire management replaced, but that real changes were implemented. Hiring practices were restructured, policies were put in place to ensure fair treatment of every customer, and the employees who had once been silenced were given a voice. The woman who had come forward with the truth. She was offered a leadership role in overseeing the transformation. And as the former manager, the man who had once judged her for her simple appearance, watched from the outside, he realized the irony of it all. The woman he had dismissed as insignificant now owned everything he had once controlled. But she didn't gloat. She didn't seek revenge. She simply smiled, knowing that real power didn't come from wealth or status. It came from standing up for what was right. And she had done just that. As the dust settled, the reality of the situation became clear. The dealership, once a place filled with arrogance and prejudice, was now undergoing a transformation. The billionaire's wife walked through the showroom, watching as employees, new and old, adjusted to the change. There was still work to be done, but the atmosphere felt different. Lighter. Hopeful. The woman who had come forward with the truth stood beside her, a mix of disbelief and gratitude in her eyes. "I still can't believe all of this happened," she admitted. "One day I was afraid of speaking up. And now, I'm part of the change." The billionaire's wife smiled, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "That's what happens when people stand together," she said. "Real change isn't about punishing the wrong people. It's about making sure the right people have a chance to do things better." Customers began to return, curious about the dealership's new direction. Some came cautiously, wondering if things had truly changed. But when they stepped inside, they were greeted warmly, treated with the respect that should have always been there. The policies had changed, but more importantly, so had the people. The former manager, now without the power he once held, had vanished from the industry's spotlight. He had tried to move on, but word spread fast. No reputable dealership wanted to hire someone whose actions had caused such a public scandal. His arrogance had cost him everything, not just his job but his reputation. As for the billionaire and his wife, they continued their lives as they always had, though something about this experience had changed them too. They had always known that wealth could open doors, but now they understood something even more important. It could also be used to open doors for others. One evening, as they sat in their garden, enjoying the cool breeze, the billionaire glanced at his wife. "Do you regret buying the dealership?" he asked. She thought for a moment before shaking her head. "No," she said softly. "Because this wasn't just about a car showroom. It was about proving a point. That no one should be judged by how they look. That respect isn't something reserved for the wealthy." She looked at him with a knowing smile. And that sometimes the people you underestimate the most are the ones who end up surprising you. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. You've always been full of surprises. She laughed, resting her head against his shoulder. The world around them kept moving. Businesses rose and fell, people chased success. But in this moment, they knew they had done something that mattered. Not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, unseen, or unworthy. The dealership continued to thrive under its new leadership, becoming a symbol of fairness in an industry often driven by appearances. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. And sometimes, better was enough to make all the difference. And so, life went on. Not with grand celebrations or dramatic endings, but with quiet victories. The kind that truly mattered.